Alright everyone, this is Matt Webb with UT Extension, Marshall County. I wanted to talk to you today about repairing hay feeding areas. Um, this is to summarize some results from a plot that we did in Lewisburg at the Middle Tennessee Research and Education Center. And this is in response to numerous questions that I've gotten from farmers and producers on how to repair these areas and make them productive for livestock production. Before I begin, I want to express my appreciation first to the Middle Tennessee Research and Education Center in Lewisburg. I appreciate the farm crew for setting off an area for me to do these plots, but also doing the groundwork and preparing the area for the plots that I set out. I also appreciate Southeast Agri-Seeds. They provided a lot of the seed for this demonstration. And also our local farm center, the Lewisburg Farm Center. They provided some seed and also some chemical that was used in this plot work. Alright, in this picture you can see what is a typical scene in Tennessee in the summer months. This picture was taken in July. Very much like the first slide, this is kind of what it turns into. All that compaction, all that wasted hay, all the manure and everything that's built up grows a variety of weeds and grasses. In this picture here we have a lot of pigweed. We have some Johnson grass that's come up. There's some goose grass there. There's some prickly cider, and there's also some goose grass and crabgrass that has come up in these plots. So when we were coming up with this plot to do, here was the three goals. We wanted something that established a ground cover. Hopefully it produced some sort of a yield that was usable by livestock, and then provided weed control, particularly against pigweeds. What we have found, the major reason why these areas are not utilized by livestock is that they avoid the pigweeds. So that's what we were hoping to accomplish in this plot work. And here's a couple of pictures. These were both taken in July. But you can see that the cattle have avoided the pigweeds. All the forage that was around the pigweeds, you can see that they graze very efficiently. And it's pretty even across the plot there how evenly they grazed the crabgrass and different grasses that had came up, but they would not touch any of the grass that was inside of the pigweeds. And I don't blame them with the thorns causing them to avoid these areas. But you can see in the picture on the right, we have 20 plus inches of forage there that's not being utilized because these weeds here are keeping the cattle from wanting to graze these areas. So here's the plot set up. This was a pasture that was formerly tall fescue Bermuda grass. There was some pigweeds present. They were stocked with 40 plus dairy replacement heifers from October to March. They were fed hay from 3 hay rings that were occasionally moved. But you can see from this picture that they have pretty much have destroyed the area during the hay feeding period. You can see there's some tractor tracks. There's a lot of mud. There's a lot of compaction. And so this is typical of traditional hay feeding systems using hay rings. So these were our treatments. We had a control where we did nothing, just whatever came up. We had a chemical only using a residual herbicide called Grazon Next. We applied it at 2.1 pints to an acre. This came about, I had one producer that runs a lot of cattle on dry lots, and he was using Grazon Next to keep the pigweeds down in his dry lots. So we were investigating whether that would work in this scenario or not. So this was kind of something that got thrown in there, and we'll see how that works out later. But we also want to investigate, wonder if we sprayed this chemical and then also overseeded it with crabgrass, and we did that with a 5 pound per acre rate. And we used a variety called Red River. We also had treatment where we used only crabgrass. Did a treatment where we mixed it with angle ryegrass, variety being Marshall, plus the Red River crabgrass. The reason we threw the winter angles in there, including some oats with crabgrass, is that we wanted to see could we get some early growth that maybe could be utilized much quicker than waiting on the crabgrass to come in. And then we went with traditional, what is considered a traditional pasture in Tennessee, tall fescue mixed with white clover, and then we did clover only. The reason we wanted to use these species is that they're adapted in our area in southern middle Tennessee. They tend to fill in gaps, and each one of these treatments we used 3 replicates, so we did each one of these treatments 3 times. All these were sown and sprayed on the same day, April the 3rd. Soil fertility, we took soil samples before and after the hay feeding period. It was already a productive soil. This was a former dairy, but the pH was 6.2 before, and it even increased after the hay feeding. It went up to 6.97, so we were almost at a 7. Phosphorus went up quite a bit. Potassium really went up a lot, almost 3 times. And all the other elements there were all in the sufficient range. So we had a high fertility soil here to deal with. So here's how we set it up. We did a rough disking. This was the last week of March. We had a wet winter. So when we did disc it, this was not the most ideal time. And when we set up these plots, we wanted to keep it as real world as possible. Even the disc had a couple of blades that were broke on it, if I recall correctly. So it was a rough disking. It wasn't the most ideal ground conditions. We did have some clods that came up, but we tried to level the plot as well as we could to help spread that hay around. Like I said, it's not normally recommended, but we did do the spraying and the sowing on the same day on April the 3rd. We added no fertilizer. We didn't lime. And from the previous slide, you can see we already had a lot of fertility, so we didn't add any fertilizer or lime. We harvested the end of May, again in July, and the last one was in September. I used a system called the Day 4 system, and that is to assess botanical composition. So I looked at what was dominant, abundant, frequent, occasional, and rare, both with forages and weeds. After each harvest, I allow a group of heifers to come in and graze for a couple of days after each harvest just to reset the plot. And then typical management in the area is that about midsummer, most of our farmers and producers will go in and do a clipping, a pasture clip. So after that second harvest, we did do a pasture clip because the pigweeds had gotten so tall. And so that was our management for these plots. This is what the seed bed looked like. It's not a perfect seed bed by any means. You can see the clods that are in the seed bed. But it did help to spread that hay around. It did help to dry the plot out a little bit to go ahead and do this disking. So this was our first harvest. This is showing the forage only. And by far the best treatment at the first harvest was the ryegrass. And the oats was a second. Both of them came up extremely well. Grew a ton or more per acre in the first 60 days from sowing. The other plots, if you'll notice the fescue and clover, since those are our more traditional mixes, they just did not establish well in this scenario. We know in our area a fall seeding of fescue works best, and spring sowings normally do not do as well. Also, we didn't have the most ideal seed bed probably for this species. So the fescue and the clover did not establish well, and pretty much after the first harvest, you didn't see any fescue or clover at all. If you look over in the crabgrass and the chemical treatments, the crabgrass was kind of slow out of the gate. Kind of expect that since soil temperatures were lower, starting in the first part of April and increasing. But the chemical treatments, the yield was low, and that was kind of expected since we were using a warm season annual grass. And for the chemical only, we were depending on whatever was coming up from the seed bank. This is the weeds from the first harvest. Um, the worst treatments for weeds was the control, the crabgrass established by itself, the fescue clover, and the clover plots. And we had anywhere from a quarter to almost a half a ton of weeds in that first harvest. The chemical treatments had no weeds. We kind of expected that with one of the ingredients with graze on next being a residual treatment. Um, the winter annuals did a pretty good job of keeping the weeds down there. There was enough biomass there that it kept the weeds down. If you look there on the very right hand side there in the chart there, the weed that was causing the most problems was pigweed or prickly cider. We did experience some dock in some of the treatments, and that was probably from the wet spots that was within the plot. So these are some pictures there to show you comparison. There's a control on the left. You can already see that pigweed is probably 6 to 8 inches tall in this picture here at the end of May. The chemical treatment had absolutely no weeds in it. The Graze All Next did a good job, but we do have some ground there that is exposed, that is open, but we don't have any weeds in the chemical only treatment. These are the winter annuals. They look beautiful. The ryegrass grew in very thick, was very leafy, very little seed heads in it. The oats were a little bit more open. You could see a little bit of the crabgrass starting to germinate and come up through the stand of oats. But if you are in a scenario where you need early forage, and particularly if you can sow it before the 1st of April, preferably sometime no later than the middle of March, I think the annual ryegrass and oats will do a good job in those scenarios. So here's the second harvest. This is 40 days after the first harvest, and this is about 100 days after these were sown. Granted, last year we had a lot of moisture at this site, but we did go a little over 3 weeks without any rain. And so we did have some spots around the area that the ground was showing cracks in the ground from the lack of moisture, but then we had some rains that came in, and these plots really responded, particularly anything that was a chemical treatment or had crabgrass by itself. You can see in the chemical only treatment and the chemical plus crabgrass, we had 3.5 to a little over 4 tons of forage in 100 days with no fertility. And I thought that was outstanding considering when you looked at those plots early on, they just didn't have a whole lot of yield to them. There wasn't a lot going on, but by the 1st of July, that crabgrass really came on. And if you look at the chart on the right, crabgrass was the abundant or the dominant forage in these plots. If you look over at the fescue or the clover treatments, they're pretty much crabgrass or goosegrass or barnyard grass at this point. There was no fescue or clover in those plots. But I want you to look at that ryegrass and oats. I mean, those were very fantastic plots in the first harvest, you know, being a ton or more and really outpacing everybody else. But at the second harvest, they yielded somewhere between 1.5 to almost 2.5 tons an acre, but the yield is dramatically decreased from the other treatments. The only ones that you can compare it to is the control, and the amount of weeds that was in control is what kept that forage harvest held back. So the winter angles work well if you want some early grazing or some early growth, but they will suppress crabgrass growth and probably any other warm season species that you're trying to grow. But one other thing I want to mention about the chemical only plot, since it was largely crabgrass, that gives me a lot of indication that there was a seed bank here, crabgrass. So that gives me some ideas that in the future on some of these plots that you can regenerate that stand from a seed bank. So this is a picture of the crabgrass plus the chemical, and you can see it's very lush. There's no weeds in it. It's very thick. When we walked out here to harvest these plots, a lot of these plots was almost to my waist, and I stand 6 foot tall. And so if this ground had been leveled off, you could very well had taken a hay cut and gotten a substantial amount of hay cut from this. Also did great for grazing. This is a picture to illustrate about what I mentioned before about the winter angles holding back the crabgrass. If you look at this picture on the left, that's outside the plot area. That's crabgrass that has largely come up from a seed bank. There's the ryegrass treatment in the middle, and you can see that there's open spots, and that's where the ryegrass was so thick and it has died out, and you can see the crabgrass coming. It's just slow out of the gate because it's been held back by the ryegrass. And there on the right, you can see all the pigweeds. It's tall. It's trying to go to seed, and it's really holding back the forage that is growing under it. So this is the weeds of the second harvest. The clover plot. The clover just did not produce any kind of help in weed control, and the control had a sense, you know, a pretty good amount of weeds in it, as you can tell from that previous picture. But notice again, all the chemical treatments, there's no weeds, and it does give me some indication that if you throw a grass of some kind out there, regardless of what it is, it does help hold back some of the weeds that we saw. And so we had pigweed and prickly cider was the two problematic weeds by the July harvest. And this again is a picture. You can see that the cattle have grazed the crabgrass and all the other grass species that were present down to, you know, pretty evenly across the plot, but they avoided the pigweeds. I mean, they would nip the ends of the pigweed stems, but they're not going to stick their head in there and get what grass is growing under those weeds. Another problem weed was prickly cider. It is hard to control. To my knowledge right now, the best option on prickly cider is graze on next. And what we all found out too is that cattle will avoid those areas as well. So those lines, those arrows are pointing towards prickly cider, and you can see how much forage is right there around those species, and the cattle would not touch it. They didn't want to graze around those weeds. So here's the third harvest. This was in September, and pretty much across the board, forage yield is fairly consistent between treatments. The ones that are lower is again the control and the white clover, and again crabgrass is the abundant or the dominant forage in this case. So we're looking at yields that's 1.5 to 2 tons to the acre here at the third harvest. So even though, say, the winter annuals, like with the ryegrass and the oats, kind of held the crabgrass back, it does try to rebound as the season goes on. Here's the weeds from the third harvest. The control and the white clover plots are again the worst plots. All the other ones that did not have a chemical applied, we're looking at zero point 0.2 to zero point 0.3 tons an acre of weeds. And the major weed is pigweed. Um, even though we have grazed these plots after each harvest, and we did clip it after the second harvest, pigweed was still coming in as a problem in these plots. So when we take all the harvests together, this is just forage here, and you look at the comparison here, we got some outstanding yields from these plots with no fertility than what was left behind from the hay feeding period. The best plots was the chemical only, the chemical plus crabgrass, and then the crabgrass sowed by itself. We got right at or above 6 tons to an acre, which for our area is pretty outstanding. And then right behind it, you're looking at um, oats and the fescue, which was largely just crabgrass, and then the ryegrass treatment. And then, you're looking at 4.5 to over 5 tons there in those plots. And then, look at the control and clover, what comes up from a seed bank. We still had over 4.5 tons of forage that came through those plots. And if you look at the green line, that's about 2.5 tons. When you look at any of the USDA estimates for our area for a hay harvest, 2.5 tons is usually the average most of the time when you look at those reports. So these plots here all beat the average by double in most cases. Now looking at weeds, by far the worst treatments for weeds was again the control and the white clover treatments, and we're looking at 1.5 to over 2 tons of lost production to weeds. That's substantial. I mean, if you want to put a price tag on that, let's say $100 a ton, then we're looking at 150 to over $200 per acre lost because of the weeds. Um, the chemical only treatments, I was very surprised considering that we sprayed this Graze On Next, this residual herbicide on bare ground, and as much rain as we did have through the summer up until the latter part of summer, pretty much after September, we didn't get a drop for a couple of months, it felt like. We got control. And, I don't know if that was the combination of having put that herbicide out there so early, and we had the residual that allowed us to have some ways to be controlled for a time period. And then we had the combination of having a lot of forage, a lot of biomass that shaded out any weeds that could come up in those plots. Or if we just happened to have the residual all the way through. But I was very surprised and thought that the chemical treatments did very well considering how much forage we was able to harvest from those plots. And then, when we added any of the grasses to it, that kind of held back any of the major issues that we had with pigweeds. They did come up, the pigweeds did come up through those, but we kept that at under a ton, and most of them was at a half a ton for the whole season, so that those were manageable. So here's the results. As I said before, fescue and clover did not establish in this type of setting. If you're going to establish fescue, you're better off to wait till the fall in our area. White clover probably needs to be done either in the fall or by frost seeding in February. Either with seeding or maintaining a seed bank, crabgrass was useful in fields where hay is fed. And I think that disking helps. Either using a disc or a box spreader to help level out these areas, to help spread that hay around, to try to break down, paths that's been made by tractor tires or by hoof action, to help level that seed bed. Just helps that seed banker, helps that crabgrass come up all the better, I think. Using Graze On Next, even when we applied it to bare ground, we had excellent weed control throughout the whole season, and you saw that in the plots that we presented. Winter angles, they do a great job getting you a quick ground cover and some early grazing. I think if we could have lightly grazed some of these grasses so that we could have got some sunlight down to the base, that might have helped that crabgrass that emerged through that stand. But I will say this, I think that if we get to April, we may be better off to go ahead and prepare that area for a stand of warm season grasses instead of using the winter annuals. If we're going to use the winter annuals, I think we need to sow them in March. If we get to April, I think we're better off to look to the future and try to get a stand of crabgrass or some other summer annual established in these areas. Graze On Next is not the only weed control treatment that you can use for pigweeds. Graze On Next as a chemical, runs about $15 to $20 an acre in my part of the world. There's a lot of these that do a good job, and that is probably cheaper. They don't have the same residual. Though Duracor, with it being a newer herbicide, does have one of the ingredients that is in Graze On Next, so I would expect the same residual with it as I do with the Graze On Next. But you can use 2,4-D Amen. You can use the 2,4-D plus the dicamba mixtures like Brash or Weedmaster. Just be careful about drift with those chemicals. If you're close to any sensitive crops, then we might want to look at something like chaparral or milestone in those areas so we don't have the drift issues. I will say this, if you are going to spray these areas with some of these products, then you probably need to wait till that crabgrass or that warm season annual forage has at least 3 to 5 leaves on it before we spray. And then if you're one of those that is not going to do any spraying, at least go out there and clip the fields before pigweed starts to produce seeds. We do want the crabgrass to produce seed if we're going to regenerate that stand every year, but we don't want that with the pigweed. So be sure to clip the pigweeds before they go to seed. So a systems approach. After hay feeding is over, disc the area in April. I understand that sometimes we have a lot of moisture in April, but try to find a spot in April, and we can do this as late as May, but I'll explain to you why I think we need to do it in April if we can. If you need to add some crabgrass, you can apply 5 pounds to an acre. I would mix it with either pelletized lime or fertilizer or sand, because the seed of crabgrass is very small, it's very light, and if you add the pelletized lime or fertilizer to the mix, it'll help that seed to spread out. I like the herd seeders that you see on the back of ATVs. They work well for crabgrass. You can use a drill, but in our scenario, we use disking and we use broadcast seeding because those are more readily available for people. If I am going to use a drill, I'm basically using the drill to drop the seed on the ground and use the press wheels to press the seed in the ground, because it's such a small seed, we don't want to go more than a 1/4 inch into the ground. Again, with the broadcast spreader, we may need to overlap, because what you're going to have is that the fertilizer is going to spread, or the pelletized lime is going to spread out wider than the spread of your grass seed. So you may want to overlap so you can get some even spread across the field. The picture there on the right that is what 5 pounds of crabgrass seed looks like. So that's a gallon freezer bag. If you pretty much fill it up, you got about 5 pounds of crabgrass seed. Use appropriate weed control measures. I've already told you what the options were on that. You can start grazing the crabgrass at about 6 inches, but since these are angles and they don't have the deepest root systems, we do want to leave 3 to 4 inches so that we have some leaves there that allow that stand to regenerate very quickly. If I'm going to do a hay harvest, I'm going to make sure my harvest heights are going to be at 4 inches. So be sure to put some of those boots or some of those that will hold up the mower up higher, as high as 4 inches off the ground, so you're not digging into the ground when you're cutting hay. At some point, allow the stand to seed itself out. Graze it prior to frost. The cattle will spread some of the seed around, but cattle really don't like to graze frosted crabgrass very well in my experience. So try to graze it out before the frost and then repeat it next year. If the stand reseeded itself well, then you may not have to add any additional seed. But if you feel like you are having some gaps in the stand, you can always come back and overseed with 3 to 5 pounds to an acre and fill those gaps. Talking about timing, and this goes back to my comment where I feel like we need to disc and try to get some of this stuff done in April, no later than the 1st of May. The University of Tennessee does warm season annual tests every year on different varieties. Crabgrass is always included, sorghum Sudan, pearl millets, and I think all those species would work well in this scenario, though with sorghum Sudans and pearl millets, I may want to use a drill with those species. But each year they do these trials, and most of the time they try to hit the 1st to the middle part of May when they put these trials in. But last year, because of so much moisture, they waited till the middle part of June. And they always use the same recipe. They sow them down and they put 60 pounds of nitrogen at seeding and 60 pounds of nitrogen after the first cutting. So there's always 120 pounds of nitrogen that goes out on these variety trials. And last year, they got 3 tons as an average for the crabgrass and the sorghum Sudan varieties, which is not a bad yield. And so that gives me some hope too that if we get late, we can still put these species out there and get some good yields. But if you notice the year before where they were able to put them in a month earlier, they got double the yield, even though they used the same nitrogen, same fertility as they did for 2019 versus 2018. And it can be the same. 2016 was a dry year. The sorghum Sudan still did better in that year. 2015, you're looking at 4 tons for the crabgrass and almost 7 for the sorghum Sudans. And so all of them had the same fertility, 120 pounds of nitrogen. So I think timing is very important. If we're going to stretch those fertilizer dollars, then we need to be timely about getting these practices done. And being able to use those nutrients that's left over from the hay feeding period as well. These are just some crabgrass varieties that are available on the market. UT does a lot of these varieties, and you can look up those variety information as well as any other warm season annual grasses on utbeef.com. Red River was the original one released by the Noble Foundation. Quick and Big, Spreader, and Big River are all marketed by R.L. Dalrymple, who came up with the original Red River. Mojo is a blend of Red River and Impact. Impact is the newest variety. It matures about 10 to 14 days later than Red River. And so they are blended and marketed as an early and late variety in that blend. But you can see also from this picture how small that crabgrass seed is. And a lot of them come coated now, and that's supposed to help with germination. And one tip on crabgrass, Um, First year seed does not germinate as well as second year seed. So when you're looking on the market to buy crabgrass seed, look to buy aged seed that's 2 years or older seed. They will germinate quicker and better. The first year seed will germinate. It just spreads that germination over the season. So, but I would go ahead and buy an aged seed to use if I'm going to go with a crabgrass variety. Something to think about. I'm just throwing this out there as an idea, but let's think of the average Tennessee cow herd as being 30 cows. Our typical hay feeding period may be 150 days or 5 months during the winter months. If we take those 30 cows and feed them 30 pounds of dry matter a day for that 5 month period, we need 6.5 tons of hay. If we're using hay rings, we expect to get 20% or less hay waste. So if we go with 20%, that's 81 tons. If I'm assuming I'm going to get 4 tons of yield, similar to what we saw in these plots that I did this year, as well as what we saw from the UT variety trials, you would need about 20 acres. So I'm putting it out there. Could we produce some or all the hay we need from the same field that we fed hay on, and recycle those nutrients that we put on that field from those cows during the hay feeding period? Just a thought, just an idea. But if I'm going to do this, I'm going to also ensure, one, that my soil fertility is up. In my plot works, I was already using a soil that was high in fertility, and we added fertility to it during the hay feeding process. Also, I'm going to do a good job of disking and level that in areas so that when I go into to do a hay harvest, I'm not bouncing around on the tractor and wearing my equipment out. I'm also going to cut my strings off my hay, and I'm going to discard those strings so that I don't get that bound up in my mowing equipment. So those are all things you need to think about if you want to try to do something like this. I was asked about possible costs, and so I'm using some of the rental rates that I've looked from Tennessee and Kentucky publications. I think certainly that if you own your own equipment, then you probably can get some of these figures down cheaper than this. But if we go with a rental rate for disking, that's about $15 an acre in our area. If I'm overseeing a crabgrass stand for the first time, or I'm trying to thicken a stand up, if I'm using that 5 pound rate, if you look online or you talk to your seed dealers, crabgrass is going to run anywhere from $5 a pound to $8 a pound in most cases. And so if we're using a 5 pound rate, that's $25 to $40 an acre. To get a residual herbicide sprayed in my area, we're looking at about $15 to $20 to get that sprayed. If I own my own sprayer, maybe I can do it cheaper. But for overseeding a crabgrass stand, we're looking at $60 to $75. And when I talk about overseeding in this case, I'm talking about using a broadcast spreader. And so we're looking probably about $60 to $80 an acre in that case. If I have a crabgrass stand that is consistently reseeding itself, it gets much cheaper. So $15 for the disking, $20 for the herbicide spray. So we're looking at $35 there. So that pretty economical practice, I think, in that regard. So with that, this is the end. This is just a picture to encourage you to try this practice. This is a nice stand of crabgrass that came up. This was not a seeded part of the plot. This was from the seed bank. So that's to give you some encouragement on this. But good luck in trying to repair your hay feeding areas. Thank you.